Welcome to the programme. Iran has fired more than a dozen rockets at two Iraqi military bases hosting hundreds of US troops. Tehran has described its response as proportionate and that it's acting in self-defense and is not seeking war. There's no official word yet on casualties. Iranian state media said that tens of missiles were fired within minutes of the funeral of Qassem Soleimani, the general whose assassination raised the tension in the region. Donald Trump has tweeted that all is well and that he'll make a fuller statement later. Ryan Thompson has the latest.
At least two air bases housing U.S. troops in Iraq have been hit by more than a dozen ballistic missiles, according to the U.S. Department of Defense. Iran state TV said the strikes were revenge for the killing of Revolutionary Guard General Qassem Soleimani. The missiles landed at bases in Al-Assad and Erbil. The Al-Assad base houses about 1,500 U.S. and coalition forces. U.S. officials say there's been no casualties to military personnel. Some unconfirmed reports say Iraqi citizens were caught in the line of fire. It marks the first time in recent years that Washington and Tehran have attacked each other directly, rather than through proxies in the region. Using Twitter, Iran's foreign minister confirmed that Iran had launched the missile attack, but added, "We do not seek escalation or war, but will defend ourselves against any aggression." The Pentagon says the missiles had been launched from Iran and targeted at least two U.S. bases housing U.S. military.
The letter was sent, and I understand it was an unsigned letter.
U.S. President Donald Trump has defended the targeted killing last week of Iran's top general, saying the United States saved a lot of lives. Taking to Twitter Monday night, the president tweeted that all is well. The attack on U.S. troops marks a major escalation and raises the chances of an open conflict erupting between the two enemies, which have been at odds since Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. Ryan Thompson, Euronews.
Well, joining us now for the latest from the region is NBC News correspondent Cal Perry, who's in Doha. Thank you for speaking to us. What more do we know at this point?
Right now, there is an absolute lull, which is good news. We've had sort of bombastic rhetoric from both the Iranians and, of course, from the U.S. president as well. But that tweet from the foreign minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, they're really seeming to ratchet down tensions, at least temporarily, which is good news here for the Gulf nations. I'm in Qatar, which, of course, houses the largest U.S. base in the region. And it was something of great concern overnight. The Iranians made a statement saying anybody who assists the U.S. military in a strike against Iran will be held accountable, and those countries will become targets. That would include Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain. So you have a lot of Gulf nations sort of holding their breath, hoping that the ratcheting down of tensions continues and that the U.S. doesn't strike back. I think the next inflection point, Rosie, is going to be when we hear from the U.S. president later this morning.
He said that will be later on. Some people have been surprised at the speed at which Iran did respond. Just give us the details of those strikes.
Yeah, so we know that it happened, and it really coincided with the burial in the moment that General Soleimani was buried in his hometown. We know that it was a dozen or so missiles, according to U.S. Defense Department officials, and we're talking about ballistic missiles that left from Iran and went into Iraq, some 200 miles into Iraq, which is very unusual. You know, normally Iran will use its proxies to strike back or strike out or lash out at targets, but they took full credit for this, seemingly satisfying domestic consumption, hitting those two bases in Iraq. Worth noting, these are Iraqi bases that house U.S. troops. It is the U.S. bases in the Gulf that are, of course, run by the U.S. Defense Department. We know that U.S. personnel on the ground were fairly well prepared for this incoming barrage. There was an early warning system of Iran's ballistic missiles. But look, the use of these ballistic missiles themselves is a sign. It's a sign of Iran's capability. It's a sign to the U.S. that they're willing to use that capability, and they followed it very closely with that rhetoric that Gulf nations could be held accountable, as could Israel. They made that point very clearly on Iranian state television, something that you can be sure both U.S. defense officials and the Israeli Defense Forces took note of, Rosie.
At this point, we don't have any confirmation of any casualties, but how many people are normally based at those sites?
Well, we know that there are 5,000 or so U.S. troops in Iraq, but we don't have individual numbers on the base. Now, the Al-Assad air base, one of those targets that was hit, is a sprawling complex. There would be thousands of coalition forces, Iraqi forces on that base, and early indications are that those who may have been wounded were Iraqi soldiers, not American soldiers. The U.S. Defense Department, again, making that very clear. I think, what's important about this is the sign that Iran is showing to the Iraqis. I mean, it is a priority for the Iranian regime on the heels of the death of General Soleimani to get U.S. forces out of Iraq. In fact, General Soleimani's major principle, his major responsibility was to fight Iran's enemies outside of Iran, following the very bloody war with Iraq in the 1980s that killed 1 million people. That's why Hezbollah is on the border with Israel. That's why General Soleimani was accused by U.S. defense officials of killing some 600 to 650 U.S. soldiers during the war in Iraq. The idea was fight the Americans in Iraq so that you do not fight them in Iran. The priority for the Iranians is to send a message to the Gulf nations and to the U.S. itself that they need to leave the region and that they need to do it now. That has been one thing we've heard consistently since General Soleimani was assassinated on Thursday night in Baghdad, Rosie.
Cal Perry, thank you very much for speaking to us from Doha, NBC News correspondent.